There was a time when a single name made kings tremble: Mongol. In the space of a few years, that reputation ate through the defenses of kingdoms from the Pacific to the Danube. When the Mongol army smashed into Hungary in 1241, it looked as if that fearsome engine would roll on forever. Rivers of refugees, burned villages, and the shattered remains of a royal army left Hungary near annihilation. Yet 4 decades later, when a new Mongol thrust came in 1285, the result was not conquest but collapse. How did a realm on its knees force the most feared military machine of the age to withdraw? The answer lies less in single acts of heroism than in a slow, determined transformation. Stone for wood, discipline for improvisation, logistics for lightning. In the spring of 1241, the Mongol method proved devastating. Commanders famed in the sources, Batu and Subutai, used a repertoire honed on the steppes: extraordinary mobility mounted on composite horse archers, feigned retreats that turned the pursuers into targets, and a capacity to concentrate force rapidly where enemies were weakest. At Mohi, on the Sajo plain, the Hungarian field army was caught and broken. Contemporary accounts, vivid though often exaggerated, describe a scene of chaos: arrows like rain, units routed, and a king forced to flee. The material consequences were immediate and brutal. Farms and settlements were destroyed, many provinces emptied, and the social fabric of border regions frayed. Medieval chroniclers wrote of catastrophic losses. Modern historians caution that the numbers are probably inflated. Yet there is no question that Hungary suffered demographic shock and economic collapse in the aftermath. Why did the Mongols leave in 1242? It would be tempting to tell a clean story of victory followed by a triumphant withdrawal. But the truth is more complex. Several factors likely combined. The logistical challenge of maintaining large cavalry armies far from their bases. The onset of harsh winter conditions unfamiliar to steppe-light cavalry when operating in the mountains and marshes of Central Europe. And, crucially, political developments back in the Mongol heartlands all played a part. Withdrawal was not an outright military defeat for the Mongols. It was a strategic decision shaped by limits of supply, the environment, and the empire's internal demands. For Hungary, however, the shock was final proof that the old defenses were inadequate. What followed was a determination driven by King Bela IV to make sure the realm would never again face a storm with its houses still made of straw. Bela IV's response was systemic and practical. He launched what contemporaries would have seen as a program of rebuilding, but which, viewed from military perspective, was a program of strategic redesign. Wooden motte and bailey defences gave way to dozens upon dozens of stone castles and fortified towns. Wherever possible, walls were built or repaired. In the borderlands, palisade lines were replaced by thick masonry that could resist arrow storms and simple fire. These were not mere ornaments of power. They were purposely sited strongholds meant to deny Mongol forces the easy devastation of the past. The image of villagers hauling their belongings into the shadow of a stone keep, farm animals driven through the castle gate, families taking refuge in narrow, smoke-filled courtyards, became a repeated scene across the countryside. Military reform went hand in hand with fortification. Bela and his successors incentivized mounted heavy cavalry service, granting land and privileges to those who could field armored knights capable of withstanding a hail of arrows and closing with shock power. The kingdom encouraged settlement to repopulate devastated regions, inviting foreign colonists and encouraging internal migration, so that tax bases and recruitment pools could recover. There was also recognition of the need for missile power that could match or blunt Mongol archery. Crossbowmen, with bolts that pierced mail where arrows sometimes could not, were imported and trained. Ballistas and other siege engines, less common in the steppe repertoire, were sought to defend fortified places and to besiege those that might fall into enemy hands. These measures were practical, Stone walls took time and money, but they turned villages into defensible nodes. Crossbows and ballistas changed the calculus of open-field engagements by offering missiles with power and precision. All of this mattered because the Mongol world itself had changed. The colossal empire that had surged west in the 1220s and 1230s had begun to fragment. By the later 13th century, the western portion, what modern historians call the Golden Horde, operated with a degree of autonomy and internal rivalry. Figures such as Nogai emerged as powerful players, often acting with quasi-independent authority. The Mongol state was no longer a single, relentless machine directed by a handful of strategists. Competing interests, succession disputes, and the realities of ruling over a vast, diverse territory altered priorities and capacities. It was into this fractured Mongol world that a new expedition in 1285 marched. Led nominally by the Prince Talabuga and with Nogai a central influence in the Western Drive, the plan mirrored earlier ambitions, a multi-pronged incursion through the Carpathian passes, striking into Transylvania and beyond. The Mongols expected to reap quick plunder, to intimidate and to extract tribute, perhaps to revive the pattern of 1241. But events did not unfold as before. Hungary in 1285 was not the Hungary of 1241. What the invaders encountered was a country deliberately reorganized to suffer less from sudden, mobile assaults. One of the most effective measures was a scorched earth policy. When an area could not be defended in the open, its resources were removed, livestock driven into forts, grain burned or hidden, and civilians evacuated to fortified towns. These evacuations were not merely panic, they were coordinated. Families moved along prepared routes to stone keeps and reinforced towns, where stockpiled food and prepared defenses awaited them. Denying the Mongol horsemen easy forage and supplies forced them to extend supply lines into hostile country, exposing them to a new kind of attrition. The fortified towns themselves were different beasts than the wooden hamlets of a generation before. Stone walls bristled with defensive positions where crossbowmen and ballista crews could concentrate fire. Crossbows especially changed small battles. Where Mongol light cavalry relied on rate of fire and mobility, crossbowmen could deliver bolts that found gaps in armor and halted charges. Ballistas could disrupt the cohesion of mounted formations at key moments. From battlements, defenders watched the steppe riders approach and met their rain of arrows with a steady, well-aimed reply. Mongol attempts to invest these towns without proper siege trains proved costly and slow. In the field, the Hungarians increasingly relied on a different composition of force. Heavy cavalry, better equipped and better trained to charge through the arrow storms, were used in conjunction with missile troops and local militias who knew the terrain well. These heavy horsemen did not mimic the Mongol model. Instead, they exploited its weaknesses. Where Mongol success depended on open plains to use their maneuver and feigned retreats, the hilly, wooded country of Transylvania and the mountain passes complicated their movement. Narrow defiles made large-scale cavalry maneuvers risky, offering tempting grounds for ambush. One of the defining moments of the 1285 campaign unfolded in Transylvania. Talabuga's contingent attempted to press through this region with the hope of quick gains, but terrain and prepared defenses slowed them. In several encounters, Mongol columns found themselves stalked by detachments of Hungarian nobles and their retinues, who used small-scale ambushes to harass flanks and cut supply detachments. These were not dramatic pitched battles in the romantic sense. They were grinding, attritional clashes in which the Mongols were denied the freedom to operate. When one of Talabuga's forces attempted to withdraw after failing to secure decisive success, Hungarian and allied forces struck during the retreat, turning disorder into rout and inflicting losses, not necessarily in the hundreds of thousands as medieval chroniclers sometimes claimed, but certainly significant enough to sap momentum. Nogai's role was particularly telling. The Golden Horde leader could send raiding parties and field large numbers of horsemen, but reducing well-defended stone towns without a proper siege train is a fundamentally different task than winning open-field encounters. Siegecraft requires time, engineering, and logistics. The Mongols could improvise many things, but the Western contingent in 1285 lacked the sustained siege capabilities and the secure supply chain needed to invest multiple defended places across difficult terrain. Nogai's forces, confronted with stout resistance and shrinking supplies, found their options limited: invest long and risk entrapment, or withdraw. By the time the campaign faded, what had seemed at the outset like a replication of past devastation had become an exposed expedition. The Mongols withdrew in disorder from many areas. Detachments that tried to press on encountered ambushes on mountain tracks and were harried by local forces. The net result was strategic failure. The invaders did not secure lasting control, they did not extract sustained tribute, and their capacity to launch immediate follow-ups into Central Europe was compromised. The consequences rippled outward. In psychological terms, the 1285 campaign broke something crucial: the aura of Mongol invincibility in Europe. That aura had been real, earned on plains and in open battle, but Hungary's resilient defenses and the failure of the Golden Horde to translate mobility into lasting conquest showed that Mongol methods were not universally dominant. After 1285, Western polities could no longer assume that yielding to the Mongol war machine was inevitable. They could envision durable resistance. There were trade-offs, however. Hungary's success was partly built on empowering local magnates, granting lands and privileges to secure military service and to finance castles. Over time, this strengthened the nobility and created centrifugal forces that sometimes undermined central royal authority. The long-term political consequence was a kingdom more militarized and more territorially defended, but also more internally fragmented. Hungary became a bulwark for Central Europe, its stone castles and defended towns serving as a buffer against further mass incursions, even if the empowerment of nobles complicated domestic politics for decades to come. What then explains the Mongol failure in 1285 in concise terms? Several interlocking factors made the difference. First, adaptation. Hungary learned from catastrophe and reorganized its defenses: stone for wood, heavy cavalry supported by missile troops, and a network of fortified towns. Second, terrain and logistics. The Carpathian foothills and Transylvanian uplands blunted Mongol mobility and choked their supply lines. Third, political fragmentation in the Mongol world meant that Western forces did not necessarily have the unified strategic planning and resources that fueled earlier campaigns. Fourth, the absence of adequate siege capability limited what the Mongols could achieve against a landscape of stone. Combined, these elements forced the invaders into conditions for which the steppe template was poorly suited. This is not to say that the Mongols were permanently crushed in Europe by a single campaign. Their power would persist in various forms, and raids would continue. But 1285 marked a turning point. It showed that the invaders could be contained and that a determined structural response could blunt a previously terrifying advantage. Hungary's victory was therefore not the product of a single decisive field engagement, but the fruit of decades of rebuilding, a national shift from improvisation to preparation. There are human scenes behind these strategic shifts worth remembering. The families who, after 1241, chose to rebuild behind castle walls rather than scatter. The lords who exchanged fertile estates for military obligations. The crossbowmen on a stone parapet whose steady hands trusted bolt and sight when arrows filled the air. There is also the figure of the reforming king, whose policies carried costs yet changed the kingdom's fate. And on the Mongol side, there were commanders of remarkable skill, operating in an era of shifting priorities, constrained by supply, weather, and the realities of a fragmented polities. If you enjoy deep dives into pivotal battles, subscribe for more. When history demands a one-line verdict, it should be careful but clear. Hungary did not beat the Mongols by a miraculous charge or a single victory. It outlasted and out-adapted them in that theatre. The 1285 campaign turned the Mongol image from invincible to vulnerable in Western eyes. The westward momentum of earlier decades was checked not by one event, but by cumulative change. Castles that refused to fall, scorched fields that denied fodder, heavy horse that could break armored fights, and local forces that made every march costly. The king's castles and the commoner's crossbow combined to change the rules of the game. There are small uncertainties in the record that deserve a cautious note. Some names in later chronicles are garbled. For example, certain magnates whose deeds are praised are difficult to identify precisely in surviving documents. Andras li exfi, indefinido, likely Andras Lakfi. Check historical source if needed. Such ambiguities do not overturn the broader pattern. Hungary's strategic transformation after 1241 and the Mongol failures in 1285 are robust themes across multiple sources and modern studies. In the end, what matters for the title is this: Hungary finally defeated the Mongol threat in its theatre, not by a lightning stroke, but by turning vulnerability into resilience. Stone and steel, strategy and supply, adaptation and terrain, these were the tools that broke the aura of invincibility. That lesson echoes beyond the medieval field. Prepared societies can blunt even formidable foes, provided they learn, rebuild and marshal resources patiently and intelligently. Leave your take. Did 1285 change the course of European history? Comment below.